The winter morning was cold, and a thick mist clung to the streets of the city, enveloping everything in a quiet, eerie stillness. Max, a stray dog with a golden, matted coat, walked slowly down the deserted street. His body was lean and weathered, worn down by years of living on the streets, surviving on scraps of food left behind by the indifferent city. Despite his rough exterior, there was something undeniably noble about him. His sharp eyes still carried a glimmer of hope, a spark of life that refused to be extinguished. Max had been alone for as long as he could remember. He had learned to survive without the help of humans, learning to stay out of their way when they grew hostile and trusting only his instincts. People were unpredictable. Some were kind, others cruel, but for the most part, they ignored him. He was just a stray, a fixture of the streets, something to be passed by, a being unworthy of notice. But Max had learned to navigate the city with precision, seeking out food from dumpsters and the kindness of strangers who left scraps behind. Every day was a struggle, but as long as he could find food and shelter, he managed to keep moving forward. It was a quiet existence, filled with loneliness, but it was all he knew. Until this morning, there was something different about today. The air was thick with anticipation, the usual noises of the city muffled beneath the fog. Max had wandered along the street, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air for food. He was familiar with the alleyways, the dumpsters behind the restaurants, and the little corners where people occasionally threw out leftovers. But this morning, as he turned a corner near a cafe, something caught his attention, something he hadn't expected. A faint, barely audible sound, a soft whimper. It was coming from behind a nearby dumpster. Max's instincts immediately kicked in. He approached the source of the sound with caution, his body tense. He didn't know what was making the noise, but he couldn't ignore it. He padded closer, his paws silent on the wet pavement, his nose twitching. As he reached the dumpster, he spotted something, a crumpled blanket tossed aside, with something wrapped inside it. Max sniffed the blanket. His sharp nose detected a strange, unfamiliar scent, a mixture of cold and something else, something that didn't smell like food. It was something faint but urgent. Without hesitation, Max nudged the blanket with his nose. He could feel something soft underneath, something small and fragile. Then, the soft sound of a baby's whimper came again, and Max's heart skipped a beat. His instincts told him that this was something important, something he had to act on. His nose pressed deeper into the blanket, and he felt the small, cold body of a child. The baby was wrapped tightly, its skin pale, almost blue from the cold. It was still, barely moving, and its tiny chest rose and fell with the faintest hint of breath. Max felt a pang of something unfamiliar, a sharp, protective instinct. He had never known what it meant to care for another, but he understood now. This child, abandoned and vulnerable, needed help, and Max was the only one who could provide it. He quickly scooped the baby gently into his mouth, his teeth barely grazing the fragile body as he lifted it carefully. The baby was barely breathing, and its tiny form was cold to the touch. Max knew the child needed warmth, but there was no time to waste. He had to get the baby somewhere safe, somewhere it could get help. With a sense of urgency, Max turned and trotted down the street, carefully balancing the child in his mouth. He wasn't sure where he was going, but his instincts led him toward the nearby hospital. It was a large building, full of people coming and going. He knew this place was his best chance to find someone who could help. Max limped along, his paws aching, but he ignored the pain. The baby in his mouth needed help now, and that was all that mattered. The streets were empty at this early hour, and the city seemed to hold its breath as Max moved forward. He reached the entrance of the hospital, where automatic doors slid open as he approached. It was a strange sensation, walking into such a pristine, cold place, but Max didn't stop. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He moved into the lobby, his eyes scanning the room as his tail wagged nervously. People stared at him in surprise as he made his way past the front desk, where Nurse Olivia was busy filling out paperwork. Her eyes flicked up from her task just as Max moved past, and she froze when she saw the baby in his mouth. What is this?" she exclaimed, her voice a mix of surprise and concern. Max gently placed the child on the floor. backing away as he watched Olivia's reaction. She quickly knelt down beside the baby, her hands trembling as she checked for signs of life. The child was still cold, but there was a weak pulse. Olivia's heart raced as she realized just how serious this situation was. She immediately called for help, her voice filled with urgency. "Doctor, we need a doctor here, quick." Moments later, the doctor arrived, and together they quickly moved the baby into a treatment room. Max stood at the door, watching with wide eyes, unsure of what to do. His paws trembled, but his gaze remained fixed on the child. He had done what he could, but now it was up to the humans to take over. Olivia stayed by the baby's side, carefully monitoring the child's breathing. She could feel the faint pulse, but it was weak. The baby's skin had a slight bluish tint, a sign of hypothermia, but there was still hope. Max watched, his tail tucked low as he stood at the door, waiting, not sure whether to stay or leave. The warmth in the room was comforting, and the sounds of the hospital, machines beeping, footsteps echoing, were reassuring. Though Max was unsure of his place here, he had never been inside a hospital before. As the minutes stretched on, the baby's condition remained critical, but the team was working tirelessly to stabilize it. Max didn't leave the doorway. He wasn't sure if he was welcome, but something kept him rooted to the spot. It wasn't just his protective instincts toward the baby. There was something in the way the humans responded to the baby's needs that made him feel, for the first time, that he was in the right place. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the doctor turned to Olivia. "We've stabilized the baby for now. It's still touch and go, but we have a fighting chance." Olivia let out a sigh of relief, wiping the sweat from her forehead. She looked at the dog standing quietly by the door, still watching with that intense gaze. "You did it, boy," she whispered, walking over to Max and gently patting his head. "You saved this child." Max leaned into her touch, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through his body. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had done something important. He had saved a life. As the doctor and Olivia continued to monitor the baby, Max lingered in the hallway, uncertain but content. He had brought the child here, and now, his job was done. He had given the baby a chance at life. The days that followed the arrival of Eli in the hospital were filled with intense emotions, not just for the staff who worked tirelessly to stabilize the baby, but also for Max, the stray dog who had wandered the streets for years, known only for his sharp instincts and lonely survival, had suddenly found his purpose. He was no longer just a shadow of the city. Scavenging through dumpsters, he had become a guardian, a protector, and, in his quiet way, a savior. At first, the hospital staff was unsure of how to treat Max. Their protocols and rules for maintaining a sterile environment weren't exactly open to the idea of a stray dog wandering the halls. But Max wasn't just any dog. There was something about him, his quiet nature, the way he sat so vigilantly by Eli's side, watching over him with a focus that most humans lacked. Slowly, the staff began to see him not as an intruder but as a part of the healing process for the child. It wasn't just the medical care that was helping Eli recover. It was the companionship and bond that Max offered. Olivia, the nurse who had first found Max with the baby, became especially drawn to the dog. She had worked in hospitals long enough to know that healing wasn't just about machines, medications, or even expertise. It was about love, comfort, and the quiet acts of kindness that often went unnoticed. And Max had brought those qualities with him when he entered the hospital. Despite his rough exterior, Olivia could see the tenderness in his eyes. She could feel the care he extended to Eli, as if he understood the baby's fragility and the importance of his survival. Each day, Olivia would find herself spending a little more time with Max. She would slip into the room after her shift, her hand gently petting the dog's soft fur. She would watch as Max lay by the crib, his eyes unwavering, watching over Eli like a silent protector. Eli seemed to recognize Max even at his tender age. When the baby moved, stretching his tiny limbs, he would reach out and touch the dog's fur, his tiny fingers grasping at it as if seeking comfort. One afternoon, Olivia watched as Max lifted his head from the floor, sensing something she hadn't noticed. It was a small sound, A slight rustle as Eli stirred in his crib. She smiled as the baby's small hand reached out toward Max. In response, the dog carefully crawled up next to the crib and placed his head gently on the side, looking up at the baby with a protective gaze. It was as though Max knew that this little one had been through something unimaginable and was still fighting to survive. "This is amazing," Olivia whispered softly to herself. "You're something else, aren't you, Max?" The bond between Eli and Max became more evident with each passing day. Olivia could see the subtle ways that the two communicated without words. When Eli cried, Max would nudge his face against the crib, offering comfort. When Eli giggled or smiled, Max would respond with a gentle wag of his tail, his eyes bright with a quiet joy. It was as if, in a world full of chaos and uncertainty, these two beings had found each other and formed a connection so deep it transcended language, time, and even species. As Eli's health improved, so did the bond between him and Max. The baby began to show signs of strength, his cries becoming louder, his movements more deliberate. It was as if every day, he was becoming more and more aware of the world around him, and the dog that was so close by. Every time Max was near, Eli seemed to smile or stretch out his tiny arms, reaching for the dog. Max, never one to seek attention, would quietly nudge the baby's hand with his nose, his heart swelling with a sense of pride and love. One evening, as Olivia sat with Eli and Max, she watched them both in a peaceful moment. Eli was resting on her lap, his small head nestled against her chest, while Max lay next to them, his body curled up on the floor, his tail gently thumping against the ground. Olivia ran her fingers through Max's fur as she looked at the two of them, the baby and the dog. She couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the unspoken bond between them. "How did this happen, Max?" Olivia asked, her voice quiet, filled with wonder. "How did you know? How did you know that this little one needed you?" Of course, Max couldn't answer her. He simply lay there, eyes soft, content. But Olivia knew. There was no need for words to understand the connection they shared. It was a bond built on trust, protection, and an instinctual love that couldn't be explained. Max had saved Eli's life, and in return, the baby had healed something inside Max that he didn't even know needed healing. But Olivia had one more challenge ahead of her, finding a way to keep Max in their lives. She knew that Eli would soon be strong enough to leave the hospital, and she couldn't bear the thought of Max being left behind. He had become too much a part of their lives, a quiet force of nature that had played a role in Eli's recovery. And, in some ways, Olivia felt like she owed Max. He had not only saved Eli but had also taught her what true loyalty and love meant. The day Eli was finally discharged from the hospital came quickly. The doctors were thrilled with his progress, and Olivia felt an overwhelming sense of joy as she packed the baby's things and prepared for the day they would leave. But there was no way Olivia would leave the hospital without Max. She had arranged for Max to be examined by a veterinarian, and after a clean bill of health, Olivia made the decision to adopt him. She had already started making arrangements at her apartment, ensuring there was enough room for the dog and the baby to live comfortably together. It wasn't just about taking in a stray dog. It was about giving him a home, a place where he could belong, and where he could continue to be the protector Eli needed. On the day of Eli's discharge, Olivia walked out of the hospital with the baby cradled in her arms, Max walking calmly at her side, his tail wagging in quiet excitement. The hospital staff gathered to bid them farewell, many of them stopping to say a few words to Max. The once stray dog had become a beloved figure in the hospital, a symbol of hope, protection, and unconditional love. As Olivia walked out the front doors of the hospital, she looked down at Max, his eyes bright with curiosity as he sniffed the air. "This is it, boy," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "This is where we're going to make our home." Max wagged his tail in response, his eyes meeting hers with what seemed like an understanding. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at home. He wasn't just a stray anymore. He was a part of a family that loved him, needed him, and would never let him go. Over the next few months, Max, Eli, and Olivia settled into a new routine. Eli continued to thrive under Olivia's care, and Max was a constant, loving presence by their side. The apartment, once quiet and empty, was now filled with the sounds of laughter, warmth, and the occasional bark of a happy dog. Max had found his forever home, and in doing so, had become a vital part of Eli's life. One afternoon, as Olivia sat with Eli in her arms, watching Max lay on the floor, his tail thumping softly against the hardwood, she couldn't help but smile. It had been a long road to get here, but they had made it. Together, they were a family built not on blood, but on love, loyalty, and the kind of bond that couldn't be broken. As Eli giggled, reaching out to pet Max, Olivia felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was her family. This was where they belonged. And as Max nuzzled Eli's hand, his tail wagging contentedly, Olivia knew that, despite the challenges they had faced, this was exactly where they were meant to be, together, forever.